The 6th of August, 1945, began like any other summer day in Hiroshima. The sun rose lazily over the city, casting its golden light on the bustling streets. Children ran to school, merchants prepared their shops, and the hum of daily life seemed ordinary. But beneath the ordinary, a grim shadow lingered. War had already scarred much of Japan, and whispers of strange new weapons had reached even the most remote corners of the country. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the sky tore open with a blinding flash. The Enola Gay, a silver bomber high above, had released Little Boy, the first atomic bomb ever used in war. What followed was not an explosion in the conventional sense. It was a white-hot eruption of fire and energy. It obliterated everything within a mile. Buildings evaporated as if made of paper. Trees ignited from the inside out. And the river that ran through Hiroshima boiled violently. People on the streets didn't scream. At first, they couldn't. A strange, silent heat burned through their clothes and skin. Shadows were burned onto walls, the outlines of bodies frozen in the instant of death. Some survivors later recounted that it felt as if the sun itself had descended to touch the earth. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic scent of charred flesh. Among the living was Haruto, a young student who had been running late to school that morning. He had ducked into a narrow alley to avoid the early morning traffic. The moment he looked up, he saw the sky split by an incomprehensible brightness. His vision blurred, ears rang, and his skin tingled as if the air itself had turned to fire. When he opened his eyes again, his city was gone. Horror unfolded slowly for those who survived the initial blast. The injured wandered blindly through streets of fire and debris, searching for water that had turned into boiling streams of blood and ash. Families were torn apart, children lost, and the cries of the dying echoed against the skeletal remains of the city. Those who tried to help often fell themselves, overcome by burns, radiation sickness, or despair. One particular street near the Aoi Bridge became a scene of unimaginable terror. People who had been simply walking moments before were now twisted shadows of themselves. Skin peeled like paper, eyes melted into sockets, clothing fused to flesh. Survivors later described the ground as moving, as if the shadows of the dead crawled across the ruins, seeking the warmth of the living. Haruto stumbled through the chaos, helping a small girl whose arms had been seared. Her skin had blistered into blackened ridges, yet she whimpered for her mother. Haruto's own hands burned, but adrenaline drove him forward. The bridge, once a symbol of daily life, had become a stage for horror. Bodies stacked like broken dolls, shadows etched permanently onto the concrete. Nightfall did not bring relief. In fact, darkness intensified the terror. Fires continued to smolder, and the air remained thick with radiation, a silent killer. Survivors began to hallucinate, seeing loved ones among the burned ruins, hearing voices calling them into the flames. Stories spread of ghostly figures wandering the streets, pleading for water, for help, or simply for acknowledgement. They were the Hibakusha, the survivors, whose memories of that day were haunted forever. Haruto found temporary refuge in a ruined shrine. The wooden torii gate had burned, but still stood, blackened and skeletal. Inside, he prayed for the souls of the dead. Around him, shadows flickered in the firelight, forming human shapes, sometimes children reaching out, sometimes elders warning him away. Every sound was amplified. The drip of melting metal, the groans of the wounded, the whisper of wind carrying ashes like snow. As days passed, Hiroshima became a city of ghosts. The living feared the dead as much as they feared the radiation that poisoned them silently. Those who had survived the initial blast began to succumb to sickness. Hair fell out, gums bled, and fevers tore through bodies like wildfire. Hospitals were overwhelmed, corpses left in streets, and mass graves became the norm. Haruto, despite his injuries, wandered through the city documenting what he could. He saw families burned together, holding each other in eternal embrace. He saw people wandering aimlessly, muttering about shadows that followed them. And he saw strange phenomena. Some claimed to see flaming birds in the sky, unnatural lights dancing among the ruins, visions of horror that were almost certainly hallucinations induced by radiation, yet felt real to those who witnessed them. On August 9th, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. By now, Haruto had lost track of time, of numbers, of names. Entire neighborhoods disappeared. The death toll soared into the tens of thousands. Survivors whispered that the air itself carried the screams of the dead, that even decades later, those who visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki could feel the lingering horror beneath their feet. The atomic bomb left more than physical devastation. It left a psychological scar, a horror unlike any other. Survivors described recurring nightmares, flashes of white light, the smell of burning flesh, and the faces of loved ones frozen in terror. Some spoke of shadow people, emerging in mirrors, remnants of the instant death that had burned their city into memory. Haruto eventually returned to a world attempting to rebuild. Hiroshima rose from ashes, but the city itself seemed never to forget. Children grew up hearing the story of the sky that burned, the shadows that walked, and the souls that never left. And though the bombs were gone, the horror lingered not just in the ruins, but in the minds and bodies of those who survived, and in the collective memory of humanity. The atomic bombing was a human-made apocalypse. Its horror was not only in the fire and destruction, but in the invisible, silent suffering it inflicted. It created ghosts, both literal and metaphorical ghosts of memory, trauma, and radiation. Even 70 years later, Hiroshima and Nagasaki serve as grim reminders that the darkest horror is often born from human hands. The days following August 6 were a slow descent into hell. For Haruto and the other survivors, life had become a struggle between the desire to survive and the reality that death was everywhere. The streets of Hiroshima were rivers of ash and molten metal. Buildings that had survived the initial blast now smoldered, threatening to collapse at any moment. The once familiar city had been transformed into a nightmarish landscape of twisted steel, blackened wood, and human remains. Haruto wandered among the ruins, clutching his stomach from burns that refused to heal. The heat from the ground itself seared the soles of his feet. Everywhere he looked, there were shadows burned into stone, people who had been caught in the bomb's brilliance, frozen forever in poses of terror, pleading, or running. One wall displayed the silhouette of a man holding a child, etched like a ghostly mural. He couldn't look away. The image followed him in his nightmares. He found a small group of survivors huddled near a collapsed pharmacy. They were murmuring prayers, some for themselves, some for the dead. One woman, her hair burned and blackened, whispered about seeing her husband's shadow trapped in a doorway. "He moves sometimes," she said. "I swear I see him, but when I reach out, nothing." Haruto shivered. The idea of shadows moving on their own was terrifying, yet he had begun to notice it himself. In the flickering light of burning rubble, the silhouettes of the dead seemed almost alive, reaching out for warmth, for water, for life they had lost. Food and water were scarce. The rivers had turned black with ash and debris, and what little clean water remained was rationed. Survivors scavenged desperately. Haruto found a tin of rice in a half-collapsed home and shared it with a small group of children. One little boy, no more than 6, kept pointing to the shadows cast by the ruins, saying, "They want to eat too." Haruto understood immediately. The boy was seeing the lingering spirits, the memories of the dead trapped in the city. Hospitals were overflowing, if they existed at all. Many had been destroyed in the blast. Doctors and nurses were themselves victims, their hands shaking as they tried to treat burns that seemed impossible to heal. The few who survived described the horror of seeing patients' skin peel off like paper, eyes blister and melt, and limbs swell grotesquely before death claimed them. Infection spread rapidly, faster than any disease Haruto had ever known. Radiation sickness claimed bodies silently, a horror that could not be seen but was felt in every fevered groan and vomiting survivor. Amid the suffering, the psychological horror grew. Survivors began to report seeing apparitions, shadowed figures of the dead moving among the ruins. Some claimed to hear voices calling them into the fire, whispers that seemed to come from the ground itself. The phenomenon was so widespread that it became part of the city's whispered lore. People refused to walk alone at night, fearing the gaze of the dead. Children cried themselves to sleep, haunted by the specters of classmates and siblings. Even those who were far from the initial blast felt its echo. They spoke of dreams where the sky burned white, and the ground opened up to swallow them whole. Haruto's own nights were sleepless. He dreamt constantly of the explosion, the flash of light, the burning heat, the shadows frozen on walls. Sometimes he dreamed he was running through the city, but the ruins shifted beneath him, buildings growing and shrinking like living things. Shadows followed him, whispering names he had never heard, chanting unintelligible warnings. He would wake, screaming, soaked in sweat, his burns aching as if the fire of that day had never gone out. In the days that followed, Haruto saw families searching desperately for missing members. Parents called the names of children who had been vaporized, their cries echoing across streets that were now silent except for groans of the wounded. Entire blocks were unrecognizable, reduced to nothing but charred rubble and twisted steel. Some survivors claimed to find bodies perfectly preserved in death, frozen in poses of terror. They said the shadows burned onto walls were like echoes of the exact moment of destruction, haunting the living with frozen memories. Even the natural world seemed affected. Trees along the riversides were blackened, their leaves curled and lifeless. Fish floated belly up in water that had boiled in the blast. Birds avoided the city entirely, their absence making the eerie silence even more pronounced. Haruto noted that even the wind carried ash and whispers of horror, as if the city itself mourned the thousands of souls lost in an instant. 3 days later, on August 9, Nagasaki experienced the same inferno. Haruto, still wandering the ruins of Hiroshima, heard the distant tremors and saw the faint glow in the sky. Survivors who had fled Hiroshima spoke of a second city, obliterated by the same invisible fire. Entire neighborhoods vanished. In Nagasaki, rivers became conduits of charred bodies, and survivors reported shadows etched onto walls, just as in Hiroshima. Children and adults alike were traumatized beyond comprehension, for in those days of fire, humanity had glimpsed its own darkest reflection, and the shadows never truly faded.